Welcome back to Cryptic Chronicles. Today on the show, I'm joined by a fascinating guest who calls himself Julian the Philosopher from YouTube, a thinker deeply immersed in Platonic philosophy, the mysteries of Pythagoras, and the hidden esoteric currents that run beneath ancient thought. In this conversation, we're exploring the meeting point between philosophy, mysticism, and the possibility that some of the greatest minds of the ancient world were pointed towards truths far deeper than modern materialism allows. So sit back, open your mind, and let's step into the world of Julian the Philosopher. What first drew you to Plato and the Platonic tradition?
Well, I think it was probably at university where you have to pick your particular faculty. And I kind of decided back then that I thought that philosophy was actually like the core of the university. And the disciplines are all understood through that framework. So like the original university, like Plato's Academy. And then as I talked about last time, like Pythagoras's school would also be like the blueprint for the philosophical landscape.
Yeah, but was there like a specific idea, text, or a moment that made you realize this philosophy was more than just a like abstract theory and like sucked you in?
Well, absolutely. Plato himself, I think it was Alfred Lord Whitehead who said that Plato is actually, that all Western philosophy is merely footnotes to Plato. So that piqued my interest for sure.
And for people who only know Plato from school, what do they usually miss about him, do you think, from your opinion?
I think that they don't do him justice a lot. I think I was lucky to get an entire year on him. So I was able to read The Republic, which is his main work, for a considerable amount of time. And it really feels like every time you read it, you get more out of it because he really laid the foundation for all the other thinkers. The foundation for Western civilization, even, you could say.
Absolutely. So do you see Platonism primarily as a philosophy, a spiritual path, or both?
So that's an interesting question. It depends because you can do a lot of studying of philosophy. You can read all of the books, but where practicing actually comes into it, you have like the practical philosophy and then the philosophical aspect. I would say definitely he has both of those together, especially with the Timaeus. If you've ever read that particular book, there's a lot of interesting references that I usually talk about with reference to that. He talks about the demiurge, he talks about Atlantis, and he talks about a couple other things like the Egyptians having a conversation with Solon of Athens about a pre-flood era Greek society that interacted with Egypt. So there's actually quite a bit there that goes well beyond the regular scientific and rationality.
And this demiurge you speak of, this is not necessarily the same demiurge that Gnostics would talk about or vilify, correct?
Yeah, so this is where we get into the delineation between the demiurge of the Hermetic school of thought and the demiurge of the Gnostic school of thought, which are actually quite different. And I think it's an interesting topic because it seems like Gnosticism has experienced a sort of Renaissance era right now.
It has, and I cover a lot of Gnostic content with my stuff, but people are usually surprised when I'm like, I'm not a Gnostic.
Yeah, I think the Nag Hammadi library discovery really jump-started with respect to the internet's interest in these kind of topics. And the fragments that were found in that library are pretty interesting when it comes to a lot of these topics, including Melchizedek, Solomon, and also in terms of the Hermetic school, there is a big metaphysical difference between the demiurge of the Hermetic Egyptian school, and then there's a difference between the demiurge of the later Gnostic school. So the Hermetic demiurge is a positive demiurge, not an evil genius manipulator, and the the Gnostic demiurge is much more of a ill-intentioned, shall we say, creator, to say the least.
Yeah, everything was on accident. But I still think it's
Indeed, yeah.
interesting just how much of a difference there is between these different demiurges that pop up in these traditions. Like, it's fascinating because, like, you go to such extremes, like with the Gnostics, where it's like basically Satan rules the world and made the world, to Platonism, where it's like this grand architect created the world that's just kind of detached, but still like extremely powerful, but yet at the same time, just like a tool of essentially the universe itself.
Yeah, I think there's also a translation issue here as well, because in Greek, demiurge actually refers to a craftsman, and there isn't this negative moral attachment that we have to it. Whereas I think in later, where you're referring to a non-Greek speaking audience, because Gnostics are much more of a Christian oriented group of thinkers. They're heavily influenced by much more. I say that the Western civilization is Athens and Jerusalem, and they're much more influenced by Jerusalem. And I would say that uh, Plato represents Athens, and Socrates to a larger degree, since Socrates is used as his avatar to spread his philosophy.
A lot of stuff has come from Plato, and it seems like there's a lot of hidden messages and knowledge like underneath the surface for people who dig deeper. Do you think that Plato was pointing towards something like mystical beneath the surface of a lot of his dialogues?
Well, you're asking exactly the right question here. Are you familiar with the mural done by Raphael in the Vatican? The one of Plato's Academy. It has all the philosophers.
Oh, yeah.
So in that mural, you're gonna see a whole bunch of people in there that I've talked about. But you're also gonna see that under Plato's arm, he has a book, and you would think that it would be the Republic or the Symposium, or one of his other famous dialogues, or even the Apology, where Socrates actually, does his last rites, and his last words supposedly were recorded. You would think those would be the ones that he would be depicted with, but instead they chose to have him holding the Timaeus under his arm. And that's the book that Plato talked about Atlantis and the demiurge and the pre-flood era Greek and Egyptian cultures that may have existed beforehand. So there's a lot going on there that seems to be indicating or gesturing towards some kind of mysterious, um, shall we say, secrets that have yet to be unveiled.
Yeah, there's a lot of mystical stuff going on with Plato. How much of Plato do you think is a rational argument, and how much is initiation into a deeper way of seeing reality?
Well, you could argue that the later school, like Aristotle, was his pupil, and he went on to teach Alexander the Great. And Aristotle and Alexander went on to spread Hellenization and Western philosophy and culture around the Mediterranean, and then eventually to the rest of the world. But I would say Aristotle rejected a lot of Plato's metaphysics, but he accepted a lot of his moral philosophy, because of his moral framework came mostly, it seems, from Socrates. But then we also have to delineate here between the Socrates that's spoken of in the Republic, and Plato kind of using him to as a ventriloquist to kind of to spread his ideas, and which ideas were specifically of Socrates. So it's kind of a disambiguation that we have to engage in.
So, with all of like Plato's ideas, what role do myths like the cave, Atlantis, or the myth of play in Platonic philosophy?
Well, uh, the answer to that question, I would hope to pay homage to, would be the idea that Greek society itself was fundamentally based upon the Homeric myths. So you had great poets like Homer and Hesiod, who wrote a lot of these original myths that would be characterized as the golden era of Greek society, pre-Socratic Greek society. And these ideas, these Greek myths that you would be familiar with, like the Iliad and the Odyssey, for example, actually formed the foundation of the heroic archetype that was used as a cultural artifact that they used to spread their belief system. So it was like through the propagations of these myths and stories from the Homeric period, that was how Greek culture was spread. So Plato basically was very aware of the spread of the stories of Homer and Hesiod and the other poets. And he felt that Plato is essentially a poet. And his story about his utopia is definitely filled with metaphor and has so much to offer us that it's worth another look. And whenever I look at it again, there's more for me to examine.
So a lot of people they don't really know like how spiritual Plato was, because he comes off as like not necessarily like a spiritual guy at face value, but there's a lot of surprising things about Plato concerning spirituality. Like, can you explain to me or my listeners too, like how he believed like the soul literally remembers truth, or is like I don't know how to say it. Is it like real or symbolic, like his ideas of reincarnation and spirituality?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I would say that when it comes to the core of what Plato's spiritual metaphysics would be, I would say that he actually borrows a lot of his metaphysics from and some of his other aspects of his school from Pythagoras that we talked about last time, because it was Pythagoras who first brought the idea of the immortal soul and popularized it, I should say, into the Greek mind, and the Hellenic architecture of the thought process would have had to have taken place around 600 BC, 500 BC, before Plato had got there. So this belief system, I believe, was actually the immortality of the soul was actually brought from Pythagoras and then brought in through his mystery school.
Listeners, you might be a little bit confused. He keeps referencing a past conversation. It's a conversation we had on Discord that I found extremely fascinating, which made me invite him to the show. That's what he's referring to. But could you explain to the listeners the world of forms?
Okay, so the world of forms is basically a perfect realm where exists the perfect example of each of these bodies. So if you have like the world of the material realm would essentially be an imperfect realm, and you can almost see the metaphysics of the modern world taking shape. You can see its architecture forming in the foundation, a kind of a heavenly world where everything is perfect, where the perfect example of the perfect chair, the perfect person, the perfect example of everything exists there. And by those forms in that realm, thus emanates the material world and the imperfect world that we personally inhabit.
How do you understand the world of forms? As a metaphysical reality, divine mind, or something else?
So there's been a lot of discussion over the years. We've had thousands of years to discuss what exactly he was talking about, and there's a lot of answers about what going forward it really means for the soul to be immortal. And I think that goes back to the idea of why he believed that the soul immortality was so core to his belief system. And it was why it was so different than the other Greek belief systems, because at the time, the Greeks didn't believe in a kind of immortality, divine immortality of the soul. They kind of believed more so in, if you remember the river Styx, where when you died as an ancient Greek, you would go to the river and then you would have to pay the boatman with the 2 coins, and he would take you to a place that was called Hades, and Hades, you would kind of exist there as like a shadow form of yourself. And so it was like a diminished version of yourself existing in another realm. So it wasn't exactly the immortality of the soul that we'd be used to. It was much more an idea that was smuggled in through the cracks of empire. So it would have come from Egypt and Persia, and it would have come from other places that Pythagoras would have had to study at. And then those ideas would have seeped into the foundation of the philosophers of the Platonic and Socratic era.
You keep on mentioning Pythagoras. Let's kind of switch from Plato, if you don't mind, and maybe talk about Pythagoras for a while.
Sure.
So, why do you think that Pythagoras still has such a powerful mystique around him?
Well, he was credited with having one of the first math and metaphysics schools in the Western world. And he's credited even today. All of us study his works in our mathematical schools. And I think that he was instrumental at bringing together a kind of an Eastern and Western understanding of these concepts. So he was like a pioneer in this area.
Yeah, like one of the main things they were down with was the pentagram of all things, right?
Yeah, he had that as one of the symbols that he used, and as well as being an easily identifiable group because of other things like their desire or commitment to poverty, to personal poverty, to almost a collective society. They were very modern. They were vegans. They had a vow of silence for 5 years, and they had a kind of a collective sharing environment. So kind of like how do I say this? An early syndicalist Greek society.
So, do you see Pythagoras more as a mathematician, a sage, a mystic, or straight up like an occult teacher, or even like, I guess, a cult leader?
Well, Pythagoras had such an interesting effect on the Greek world that even on Plato himself, if we're going to make the argument, and I'm going to make the argument that Plato is the foundation of all Western philosophy is merely footnotes to Plato, then we have to merely ask ourselves as well, what is it that inspired Plato to be so foundational? And I would say Pythagoras, because he was the foundation. Where Plato said that if you want to study at my academy, you must study geometry, and that's where he got it from. So
Yeah.
it was like, yeah, the foundations were set by Pythagoras, and then they were picked up by Socrates and Plato and carried forward into the future.
And it was really hard to get into the Pythagorean school.
Yeah, well, the 5 years of silence probably got rid of a lot of the students that weren't committed, right?
Yeah, you had to be super committed to make it in that. Do you think that there was like an actual hidden initiatory current running through ancient philosophy and Pythagoras and all this?
Yes. That's something that I didn't get from university at all, but it was something that I had to come to an understanding on my own much later on. But then again, your learning should never stop after you leave university. It should continue. So I would say basically what I learned was that the Eleusinian Mysteries School, the Greek Mystery School, was initiating a lot of people, including Plato and Socrates and Pythagoras. So all three of these very foundational characters of Western philosophy. And you could also say rational thought, since Athens is responsible for creating some of the world's first secular knowledge. You would think they would be bound up in more of a scientific Aristotelian framework, but in reality, they were very much connected to the mystery schools and occultism and Egypt and all of the other, even the Zoroastrians also had a lot of teachings and effects that Pythagoras brought with him.
So what happened at the Eleusinian Mysteries?
So the Eleusinian Mysteries was basically a mystery school of initiatory practice where the students would basically be set through a bunch of rituals. And the rituals were about Demeter, the goddess, and it was about a ritual where Hades kidnapped her daughter. And it was supposedly this ritual is actually older than Greece. It actually goes back to the Mycenaean period. So it actually predates the Greek era. It was kind of a ancient fertility ritual, life and death kind of practice that was actually shared and brought on and carried forward into the future. But it actually predates that time period. So it wasn't invented for the Hellenic uh, golden era, but it actually predates it. And basically, it was in order to make the people believe that they had experienced a life-changing event, they would be subjected to a specific drink that was called kykeon.
Yeah, that's what I was about to ask. I was going to be like, were these people like tripping balls?
Eventually, they were given a drink called kykeon, and what we believe to be some type of mold fungus evolved on it. and it was some kind of barley drink that the fungus evolves on it. So you can almost see the kind of early fermentation alcohol practices being done. And then you kind of get a DMT kind of thing as well going on, because it seems like that what they were experiencing might have been similar to that, because all of the people claimed, although they had taken a vow of silence after, they had all shared that they were not the same person after, and they were changed by the experience.
Yeah, it's like when I took what was it, like an eighth of mushrooms when I was a teenager, and I went out in the woods. I did not come back as the same person.
Yeah, it can really be a life-changing experience. And I think for those people, it was a much more religious, spiritual experience. Like they didn't classify it as like a trip. They would have classified it as some kind of vision quest, right?
Yeah, exactly. It would be like much more of a spiritual attainment process and not looked down upon. But when people hear about this kind of stuff, like hear about the occult attached to Plato or Pythagoras, they often get skeptical. What do you think the word really means in this context, like occult?
I think that actually, in reality, Pythagoras was persecuted for his beliefs at the time, and that the secrecy was out of a need for personal safety. And considering the fact that the local government, the local Greek government, did eventually burn down his temple and then chase him to a bean field where he apocryphally, supposedly declared that he would not cross the sacred bean field, and allowed himself to be captured. Although he did believe that he was going to reincarnate and that it didn't matter if they caught him, basically. But essentially, like, he was persecuted and there was a reason for the secrecy. It was out of a need of survival.
Yeah, why was his school eventually attacked and all of this horrible stuff happened?
Well, you could also argue the same thing happened to Plato too, when Plato tried to initiate his philosopher teachings. He was actually sold into slavery as well by another tyrant. So it seems like that whenever the philosophers try to, except Aristotle, who was very successful with Alexander, but all of the previous attempts of these philosophers trying to interact with the political sphere seems to go really badly for them.
Yeah, but how did it go down? What's the story behind it? Micah, I mean, I know it,
Story
but I want the listeners to hear you say it.
The story basically is that after a while, after gaining a certain amount of audience in Croton, which had been basically demoralized before Pythagoras had appeared there by losing a battle, basically he was a good rhetorician and he was able to revitalize the people with his speech, and he gave them a new purpose. So eventually he had 500, 600 people showing up to some of his lectures. He gained a lot of influence in the local community, and people knew of him, and he was a popular person. So eventually some of his beliefs became adopted by the local government, and this didn't go down well with a lot of the other shall we say, noblemen or other families that were in charge of the local environment. So basically, the other elites didn't take kindly to him becoming another political entity in the sphere of influence.
And didn't some elite, pompous people be like, hey, let me join your school? And he was like, okay, well, do your vow of silence and do all the work to join, or you can't join. And the like princely aristocrats or whatever were like, no, just let me join. And he is basically like, get fucked.
Well, there were definite, it's funnily you say that yes, there were extremely strict stipulations for joining. He actually did allow some of the rich people did join, and I'm sure that caused a stir. The ones that were able to join were given considerably higher status than the ones that couldn't, because he gained so much influence that he eventually became a political force. It was almost like the Pythagoreans became their own political party eventually.
And that, in my opinion, is what led to his downfall and his school's downfall.
It's quite possible.
Well, it was only after he became a political force and his school became a political force that his school was burnt down, and he ran for his life and died because he wouldn't go through a bean field. Can you explain why he wouldn't go through the bean field? It's apocryphal, I know, but still.
So the story goes that some people think that he was really afraid of beans, but I don't think that's what it was. I think it was something about not wanting to trample the sacred beans because he thought they were connected to the underworld somehow. And he thought they were actually sacred. So I'm not. I'm going to take issue with the idea that he was afraid of the beans. I know a lot of people like to say that that's the reason that he wouldn't cross it. I think it was more like some type of religious significance that he had, considering his dietary restrictions and his other strange rules he was subjecting himself to. It seems like he learned these things from the East, though. If you think about where vegetarianism comes from, it comes from the Buddhist lands and influenced areas.
Yeah, and the bean stuff is actually found a lot throughout human history in all different ways. And who knows, maybe there is something spiritual to it because you even
It was
see
specifically fava beans, I think,
specifically,
that he was against. I'm not sure if that makes any difference.
well, you see like legends of beans go like in so many different human stories throughout mythology. Even in like Jack and the Beanstalk is one of the modern ones.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah, I did think of that too. So in terms of Pythagoras' school also, he was also one of the first schools in the Greek Hellenic tradition to allow women and men to both study math, metaphysics, and other occult sciences together because he believed that people and their immortal soul's reincarnation could come back as a man or a woman. So he believed that educating the women was just as important because you were educating the immortal soul of the individual as much as you were educating the corporeal vessel in which it was housed at the time.
And it's weird to see these ideas of reincarnation in an ancient Greek. I mean, I've always found that fascinating that like Plato, Pythagoras, a lot of these guys, they didn't believe the religion of the time, which I mean, obviously to a lot of people was just for show, for the masses, but they believed in spiritual esoteric paradigms that do not at face value seem to be associated with ancient Greece.
Yeah, you can see that there is an issue. I mean, if you take the most important aspect of the time period, you would say the trial of Socrates. Part of the reason that he was charged with corrupting the youth was because he was doubting the gods of this polis.
So have you heard that there's always two religions to every society? There's the exoteric version and then there's the esoteric version. The exoteric version is for the herd, for the masses. And then there's the esoteric version that usually breaks down so much to the point that if a normie did hear it, they would just be like, that's heresy.
Yeah, so it's like I guess you could see there's like entry level points at different levels of civilization, I guess. Civilizational entry points, shall we say.
Exactly. And I think that people like Pythagoras or Plato were like at the peak of the esoteric like aspects of these metaphysical or even just like religious paradigms that people lived in of the time. And that's why they were so offensive to the normal people. And if you lived in a place like Greek, which was like, what's the word for it? What's the word for pure democracy? I can't remember it, but we're literally
direct democracy.
It's just direct. Yeah. Okay. I think that you're right, actually. You could literally just be voted out of the city by the people.
Yeah, including if you know the famous historian Thucydides, he actually lost a battle and was exiled, and that's why he started writing his famous histories was because he had a lot of free time.
Yeah, so it's really interesting, this dynamic of like the deeper thinkers, the deeper secrets, the people who delve deeper. They have to balance it with the herd, which kind of like we have to do today in modern times as well. And I don't know if you've ever heard of the Ars Goetia, but it actually originates from Greece, from ancient Greece.
Yeah, I think that a lot of the ancient wisdom traditions filtered through because especially if you remember that Alexander the Great did us a great service, pun intended, by creating the Library of Alexandria, which ended up copying a whole bunch of this knowledge and allowing for it to be disseminated throughout the Hellenic world that he helped to create.
Oh, yeah. It's called creative destruction. Alexander the Great is one of the greatest examples of that, no pun intended. But also you got the Mongols, who are also wonderful at creative destruction, where their actions were horrific, at the bottom level, ground zero level. But at the big picture level, they were very beneficial, which is hard to like understand when you're thinking of like the paradigm of good versus evil. There's like the macrocosm and the microcosm way of looking at things. And most people can't really see the macrocosm point of view, and they just see destruction and evil. I don't know where I'm going with this.
Well, I can actually see a point that you can get there is that what the Mongol Empire really did was spread horseback riding, and they spread archery on horseback, which really changed warfare as fundamentally, because after that point it was basically, for the Byzantines, after that point it was all horseback warfare, and the soldiers were no longer on the ground anymore. And one of the reasons for that was because of how effective the Scythians and the Mongols had been on horseback. Before that, you're thinking of chariots and stuff, right? So it was very expensive for people to be able to fund their own campaigns. But once you go further and further in, you start seeing the cavalry appear, right?
Well, yeah, it's also the Silk Road was created from the Mongols, and it just created a cultural renaissance after the dust settled, to the point where civilizations all across the world, even in Europe, just like went into overdrive with their creativity and uniqueness.
Yeah, I like to make the argument that a lot of the Renaissance era and the Enlightenment was triggered by the release of documents and people and ideas from Constantinople. When Constantinople fell, that was basically the time period where Greek humanism had a Renaissance period.
Yeah, that's where all of the mystery traditions that Europe lost during the Dark Ages, during the collapse of Rome and all of just the chaos that followed, all of the stuff that they forgot was given to them again after Constantinople fell. I mean, that's horrible. The Byzantine Empire falling is horrible, but creative destruction, right? It reinvigorated Europe, and I think, in my opinion, inspired the Renaissance.
Very much so. If you think of thinkers like Leonardo da Vinci, for example, he was very much inspired by the Romans and their writings and their engineering, and he took it to the next level where he was actually able to bring it into real life. And he was able to create steam machines, flying machines, some of the earliest diagrams of devices that actually, they inspired the Wright brothers. They inspired people today. All of the airplanes and all the designs that you can think of, they can trace back to the Renaissance period and Leonardo da Vinci's sketchbook.
Dude, you must have like a fucking huge IQ. I have never been able to talk with people on the same level as I'm talking with you now.
Oh, I appreciate that. Thank you very much. I mean, I think having a lot of time to read and study philosophy has really given me like a kind of an insight into history in a lot of ways that I think a lot of other people, I honestly think that anyone has the ability to use philosophy. I kind of think of it like my Batman utility belt, that I can kind of pull it out and use it to benefit myself in a variety of situations.
I could say things and I can ask things and I don't have to explain any of it. And you'd be surprised how rare that is. Like, I really appreciate you, man. You are something else. I don't want to sugarcoat you too much, though. Something else I want. Do you see like a connection between Pythagorean mysticism and later traditions like Hermeticism, Neoplatonism, Kabbalah, or ceremonial magic?
Uh, yes, specifically because Pythagoras traveled to Egypt and was a rare occurrence for a foreigner, especially a Greek, to be able to be initiated into the Egyptian mystery schools. He was initiated into the Egyptian mystery schools, and then the Persians attacked Egypt and ended up enslaving Pythagoras and bringing him back to Babylon, where he ended up learning from the Zoroastrian mystery schools. And then he ended up back in Greece, where he was initiated by the Eleusinian mysteries. So it was basically the trifecta of mystery schools that Pythagoras brought with him and smuggled through the cracks of empire, these ideas And it was really foundational to the philosophical school, because if you think, the school of the Eleusinian Mysteries did not close until later, much later, even after Marcus Aurelius, who was also initiated. If you think of him as the great Stoic emperor, he was also an initiate of the Eleusinian Mysteries. It was only until much later, after Constantine, when Christianity had become the state religion, that the Greek mystery schools were forced to close. But they had been initiating people for hundreds of years after Jesus as well.
You mentioned Zoroastrianism, which I love. And a lot of people don't understand just how much of influence Zoroastrianism has on Christianity. And not only that, though, the influence that so much has had on Christianity that people don't really want to acknowledge. I don't know what I'm trying to ask you here.
Well, I can take it from there. So there was an early cult called Mithras, the cult of Mithras, and it was very popular in the Assyrian, Persian empires, and it became very popular in the military in Rome because it was like a war type of cult, and essentially it was adopted by the Roman military, right? And basically, you can see also, I would say that these belief systems became ingrained within the cultural attitudes and the belief systems of the Romans as they absorbed more territory. They became associated with more belief systems, and that's how the Romans started having this like pluralistic idea, right, where you already have, the Romans had 12 gods in their pantheon, the same way that the Greeks did, right? And basically they had one to one, they just changed the names, but they had a lot of the same ones. So within a polytheistic framework, the Romans had to understand, after they gained the empire, how are they going to make peace with all of these other belief systems?
Yeah, they had to absorb them, right?
Especially Alexander the Great, who actually was also initiated in the Persian mysteries and actually became the king of kings when he took over Persia. So actually, after Alexander the Great conquered Persia, you could argue that Persia became part of the Greek Hellenic world.
Yeah, like Ahura Mazda and Ahriman and all that stuff. You see, I mean, they weren't necessarily like unique. They were late players to the ancient world, but you could definitely see their influence in Judaism and Christianity.
Yeah, there's definitely a cultural sharing that takes place, and you can see these ideas being passed on. And I think that the good ideas definitely go on. Like the immortality of the soul is an idea that you can see that different cultures can see the validity in it, regardless of what other aspects are attached to it.
Which is weird too, because like a lot of times when pre Zoroastrianism, everybody thought of the afterlife as just this dark place that was unavoidable. What is the soul in Platonic and Pythagorean framework?
So in the years after, we basically have an answer to it, which I really enjoy sharing. If you've have you done any research on Hegel?
Yes, you love the Hegelian dialect. We talked about that in the last time we talked.
Yeah, sometimes three things happen. But I also would say that Hegel basically had this system where basically he believed that um, what he called the Geist, or the ghost of the time, when you think of the phrase the Zeitgeist, it comes from the German, and it means ghost of the time. And basically, there's the spirits, basically, the soul of the time would be like a particular time period has specific cultural artifacts that it creates, like art or music or paintings or poetry, right? And that spirit of the time contends with other spirits of the time from the past and the future. And all of those spirits of the time are essentially the collective souls of humanity. And when you take all of those collective divine human individual souls and you combine them together, you get what Ralph Waldo Emerson would have referred to as the oversoul, or essentially the collective direction of all human souls together, and what the purpose Hegel is trying to determine what the purpose of the human project is, by examining the direction of travel of the immortal soul.
Do you think that you can define the Hegelian dialectic?
I don't know if I can do it justice in a short period of time. Essentially, the Hegelian dialectic, the German idealism, is borrowed from the Platonic dialogue, and essentially it combines Christianity and Greek thinking together and tries to unify them. Instead of privileging one above the other, Hegel finds a way to reconcile the Greek beliefs by saying that in the Trinity, the Holy Ghost is actually the Geist, is actually the God of the philosophers. So that's how Hegel reconciles the idea that, for example, Plato has the realm of the forms where the immaterial exists. This is the God of Plato's philosopher. This is the Platonic forms God, and it also exists within the framework of Christianity. You can actually see the Platonic philosophy being smuggled through the cracks of empire and actually becoming part of the Trinity of Christianity. So basically, Hegel was able to explain that Plato actually does not only make sense, but also complements Christianity and Western civilization.
Nobody really understands the Hegelian dialectic, and I honestly don't really understand it as well as you do, but I do comprehend it to a degree, and it confuses me even now.
Yeah, he's definitely the most one of the most incomprehensible writers. Like I've read the Phenomenology of Spirit. I have it here, and it still evades me. Like I said about Plato too. I've read it like maybe 10 to 15 times, and it's still there's still more to discover every single time because they've layered so many metaphors and double, triple, quadruple entendres that it's almost like we need to read it almost for the rest of our lives and just keep it with us essentially.
Yeah, I'm almost like shameful in saying that I don't understand it.
Well, it's not your fault. I think that I wouldn't say that I fully understand it either. I would say that that's why I tried to summarize it in saying it was an attempt to reconcile the German 18th century with the Platonic 4th century.
So, from your personal point of view, has studying these traditions changed the way that you live your life?
I would say that it makes me value things like democracy a lot more. It makes me value the rights and freedoms that I have as a Canadian citizen, and it makes me value the democratic process much more than just a ritual that we perform, but a meaningful and long enduring tradition that we practice. I think that's definitely put that into my head. Although Plato would probably say that democracy is not a good thing because because look at the result, how his teacher suffered under the tyranny of the majority. But I would say that Athens itself provides a kind of moral center that I can refer to at almost any time, and it kind of gives me solace and purpose. And I think that that's what people need in this world, especially.
That's beautiful. Yeah, I think direct democracy is bullshit and doesn't work. It's good to have representative stuff. But is there like a Platonic or Pythagorean idea that you think people should meditate on more deeply, like despite like any surface stuff?
I would say that the concept that virtue is something worth examining and something worth thinking about, and what a good life is something that Socrates would often ask to all the citizens when he did his rounds. And it stays with me my entire life since I heard about it. And it's basically this idea that we don't really know what a good life is, and we're all kind of trying to figure it out as we go along. And it's important for us to have these discussions so that we can help each other along this journey and help vindicate the human spirit on the way towards the commission of this project of, I guess you could say, the Hegel would say the unification with the soul with its creator after purification.
That hurt my brain. Yeah, but what mystery within these traditions still fascinates you the most?
What's really surprised me the most is actually how much a lot of these thinkers were deeply engaged with the mystical. that I spent most of my life within the Athenian school of secularism, and I never really bothered to examine the religious component. I just kind of dismissed it, and I didn't realize that there was such a wealth of knowledge within the theological that it was a waste not to observe it.
Dude, I could listen to you talk for hours. This is crazy. I definitely need to have you on the show in the future because I've never met anybody as smart as you.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate that. I guarantee there's smarter people than me, but I still appreciate that.
What do you think that the ancients understood about reality that we have forgotten in modern times?
I would say proximity for sure, because referring back to Hegel again, humanity itself is in a process of self discovery. And humanity was in its infancy, as if imagine humanity was one subject, if all humans were one subject. And this subject is going through the stages of life, like the Hegelian dialect, the beginning, the middle, and the end. During the beginning of humanity, we were all in our infancy and we really didn't truly understand the nature of things. And then through adolescence, we begin to understand things and begin to have recorded history that we can refer back to. And now in the postmodern age, we have a wealth of history to refer back to. And you could argue that whether you're talking about humanity in general or the collective unconscious or the human soul, the immortal human soul or oversoul, all of these concepts, humanity has now become self-aware. And that process of self-awareness is something that we should take account of.
How so?
Because it means that humanity is maturing in a way that Hegel described, meaning that the more self-aware we become of history, it's like all of history becomes alive at the same time. Instead of history being confined to a specific time period, it's like now we have all of the great cultures interacting with each other at the same time in real time, and all of history is alive.
Do you think that modern humans are even evolved to comprehend that kind of stuff, like all the constant information bombardment that we have?
I think that some humans have the capacity to understand these issues, but I don't necessarily think that accumulating knowledge is necessarily the height of human existence, because I would place wisdom above knowledge. And I think that's a much more Eastern perspective. But I think in Western school of thought, every day you should be adding something new, learning something new. But in an Eastern school of enlightenment, you would say enlightenment is removing something every day rather than adding something every day. I would say wisdom is actually the accumulation of knowledge to a point where you act with virtue and courage. And you could argue that all of that courage is basically the point at which all the other virtues are measured.
Wow, I agree with that 100%.
And it's really important to study the virtues, because I believe that nowadays these ideas don't really, these are kind of ancient ideas, a Hellenic society. Like, I'm glad that we've carried democracy into the future, but I think that the virtues of living a good life, being a good person, and figuring out what those really mean and articulating them in a meaningful fashion has been lost in the process. It's been lost in translation, shall we say.
Yeah, man. So, I mean, this is kind of an out there question. I probably shouldn't even ask it, but do you think philosophy was once meant to awaken the soul rather than just like jerk off the mind?
Yes, very much so. Especially people like Pythagoras and Plato and Socrates would have been very focused on the wealth of the soul. And they would have considered wisdom, the accumulation of wisdom, to be one of the highest degrees of virtue, because it would mean that you were living a good life and living in accordance with nature. And they believed that this was the purpose of life and not to accumulate material things the way we live today. So they would have lived a very different existence.
Yeah, it's like Diane Fortune. Have you ever read anything from Diane Fortune?
I know about, well, I know they were incredibly British.
You aren't quite an occultist, are you? You're very much a philosopher.
There's a lot of intersection actually. Like the other day, I had a debate with someone about Aleister Crowley, and I was able to use Friedrich Nietzsche and Darwin to contend with Crowley's morality, because Crowley actually said that Nietzsche was the avatar of Thoth. So there's a lot of crossover even with the occult. You'll find that a lot of these people will be cross-referenced between them. So there's a lot of interdisciplinary discussion taking place here.
Yeah, there's so much crossover. It's crazy. We could talk about this for hours, but we are coming up to the end of the episode, so we probably should focus a little bit on my side, not yours. Because I've been having a fun time just listening to you. I really, really, really appreciate your intellect. Holy crap. I don't think I've ever met anybody that was just so articulate and knowledgeable about Platonism.
I would honestly credit most of my teachers with that, because I would give them all the praise for it. I wouldn't be able to do it without them. So I think we should all thank Western University. We definitely underestimate the degree to which the foundations of Western civilization appear to us to be based on a rational scientific foundation. But we also have to ask ourselves, who were the first scientists? Who were the first philosophers? And how influenced were they by these secret societies? And I would postulate that Western civilization is the civilization of secret societies.
Do you think that truth is something that we invent, discover, or even remember?
So in terms of, I would say that Plato would say that the people who tell stories control societies. And so we have to determine who are the people that are telling the stories and figure out what their motivations are. And I said earlier that Western civilization, in its earliest iteration in the Homeric tradition, was an oral tradition of storytelling. So Western civilization is a collection of stories we tell about ourselves.
What is the relationship between beauty, truth, and divine knowledge in your view?
So Socrates asked a question, are things good because the gods like them or prefer them, or are they good independently of the gods? And I think that the conclusion, I believe, was that things are actually good independently of the gods, and that that the good has to be something that we can acquire in this lifetime. And I believe that, based on a Stoic belief system, which is actually a very positive metaphysics, all the things that are necessary for us to live a good life do genuinely exist on this earth today for us. So we don't actually need to wait for another world or another realm for those things to happen.
Yeah, people love to talk shit about Stoicism, but it's actually extremely positive. Could you explain to me how Stoicism had a huge influence on Christianity, just like Zoroastrianism?
So Stoicism itself evolved from Zeno, the philosopher, and also through a Socratic disambiguation as well, meaning that the Romans took what they needed from Greek civilization and crafted Stoicism from the marble that had been left over. And I would say that Stoicism, in the Platonic sense, refers to the silver-souled individual from the myth of metals. So that would be the warriors, the government administrators, the guardians of society, the people who keep things functioning. And those people need to operate from a Stoic principle because they are the ones that keep things going. They are not the golden souled individual, and they're not the bronze either, but essentially they would be the exact kind of people that the Roman Empire would have needed in order to have brave and honorable men and women to carry out the goals of empire.
Okay, so you said that, but there's no context. What's the difference between the silver, bronze, and gold soul?
So the myth of the metals comes from Plato's Republic, where he talks about it's basically essentially this idea that he puts around that certain people are in his utopia were meant for certain different activities. So he kind of assigned people different roles based on the soul, and essentially the philosopher king was at the top, and the philosopher king was like essentially from an occult perspective the most integrated individual who had integrated their shadow self from a Jungian perspective, but had also integrated the three other levels as well. So he basically used it as kind of a tiered class system within his society, but he actually used the human soul itself as the delineating factor, not race or religion or creed or gender. He actually genuinely used the soul, which was a very interesting way to delineate society itself, and shows you how influential the immortal soul was on his belief system.
Okay, man, we're coming on the hour. Is there anything that you want to plug for yourself?
Yeah, well, I write on Medium right now on a variety of topics. I do the philosophy of cyberpunk metaphysics, which is, a belief system that I'm propagating that helps us navigate the modern world's dilemmas, including technology, Zen philosophy, and Greek Stoicism, and putting these ideas together to be able to tackle some of these difficult problems that we wouldn't have had to do in the ancient world. But I think some of these solutions that they had in the past can actually tackle these modern problems more effectively than just approaching them from a secular worldview perspective.
What's your YouTube channel?
Julian Philosophy. It's going to be a little hard to find, so I'll have to send it to you, because there's another Julian Philosopher as well, so not the only one.
All the links to Julian will be in the show notes and description of this episode.
Thank you so much for
joining us on Cryptic Chronicles.
We hope to have you on the show again in the
future.
I really appreciate that, and thank you so much for giving me the opportunity. I always appreciate the platform, and if there's anything that I can do in the future, let me know. Our participation together can bring a lot of value to all the listeners and hopefully improve the quality of life for all of us in the process.
Thank you so much, and it has been an honor to have you on the show.
Thank you very much, and keep doing that philosophy. I really appreciate the opportunity. Take care.
That's all for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed this fascinating conversation with Julian the Philosopher. Cryptic Chronicles is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podbean, Spreaker, Stitcher, and all podcast hosts. You look for us and we're there. If you can, listener, please make sure to like, comment, and review wherever you hear this content. The interaction makes algorithms like the episode, and so will help spread it and grow the show. Though Cryptic Chronicles is free to listen to, the cost to produce it is substantial. By pleasing the gods of the algorithm, you are doing more than your part in support. And as always, I'd like to thank my current patrons: MJ Calvo, Adrian, John, Celestial Weavers, Alien X, Lorna Grubb, Rodius, Jimmy Woods, Phantom Wolf, Lee Gray, 6-1, Dave Baxter, David Abrams, Lenny Louviere, Juliet Pagel, Kyle Hanks, Leontine Verhoff, Francis, Job, Eric Perez, Stephen Trizell, Jason Hackman, John Santos, and all the rest of you over 100 wonderful supporters right now. Thank you so much for supporting Cryptic Chronicles, but most of all, thanks for listening. And as the greatest philosopher who ever lived once said,
"The eye sees only what the mind is prepared to comprehend."